So thank you for joining us at such a late hour, Lord Monckton. Greetings from Mexico again. We've got some.
Greetings from the United Kingdom. Bless you all.
We've got students from France, the U.S., Mexico, Australia, and I'm a Croatian American myself. Our course is called Environment and International Relations, and so we're looking over. We spent the first part of the course discussing anthropogenic global warming, and so we looked at it from one perspective, and we looked at it from the skeptics' perspective, and we have a mixed bag here in the class. And so maybe first, if you can tell us how much time you've got.
Well, as long as you like.
All right. So perhaps if you'd like to start out to give to discuss some things yourself, and then I have a list of questions I'd like to ask, and then we'll have students ask their questions at the end of the discussion. Does that sound all right?
All right.
So perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about your background, and then what else you'd like to say.
Okay. I was educated at Harrow School and then at Churchill College at Cambridge University, and my main subject is classical architecture. So the first thing you need to know is you're not talking to a specialist on climate change or the environment. However, I went on to work, among other things, for Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And at that time, which was a quarter of a century ago now, I advised the Prime Minister that there might be a problem with global warming because it was clear that we were adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It was clear from long-established scientific experiment that if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, some warming will result. And it was also clear that, therefore, we could expect that we were going to have some effect on global temperatures and via global temperatures on the climate more widely. And so the question really was, how much warming were we going to cause? And at that time, we didn't know. The scientists were worried that it might be quite a lot. But we didn't know, and so my advice to Margaret Thatcher was that before we start throwing taxpayers' money away on this subject, we should check. That's how science works, not by believing stuff, but by checking stuff. You might have an idea, you might think, well, maybe global warming could prove dangerous, and you say, all right, that is what in science is called a hypothesis. It is a testable scientific statement. And then what you do is you go about testing it. And so my advice was that we needed to bring about a situation in which the United Kingdom had the relevant scientific and economic expertise to decide for itself, rather than merely believing what other countries might tell it, whether or not there really was a problem with global warming. Now, you may be, at one level, rather surprised to find that our first approach was a purely inquisitive one. We were asking questions. We were not imposing political advice. Because when it comes to important scientific matters, then it is not the right thing for politicians to decide these matters purely on a political basis. For instance, just about every Marxist in the world says that global warming is terrible. They have adopted a scientific position, not for scientific, but for purely political reasons. Now, in Margaret Thatcher's government, we didn't do that. We tried to find out what the truth was, and at that time, it wasn't known what the truth was, and to a very large extent, it still isn't. But what we can now say is that the extent of the likely damage from any warming that might result from us adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is likely to prove very much less than had originally been feared. And what I'd like to do is just to explain very briefly why that is so, and then what I want to do is move on to the economic aspect of the question. Now, the reason I take this approach is that, first of all, you need to know roughly what kind of a ballpark you're in scientifically. Okay, we all accept, as anyone must, given the experiments that have been done since 1859, that carbon dioxide causes some warming. The question is, how much? And it is that question, and not the question whether carbon dioxide is warming, that is at the center of the scientific debate.
On that one point, could I just interject for a second?
Sure.
We looked at it from sort of a climate alarmist or warmist perspective,
Yeah.
and then we looked at it from a lukewarmist perspective, and then we divided into a third category with the skeptical perspective. And I've gotten on some email lists as I've been in contact with climate scientists, and I'm not sure. I got copies of some of your exchanges with other scientists somehow, and there seems to be discussion with certain scientists, such as the sky dragon slayers, where they discuss that the greenhouse gas theory is false. Could you address that perhaps for a second?
Yes, of course. Very briefly, because it doesn't really deserve too much consideration. The original propounder of what is now known as the scientific method, which is the way of reaching the truth about a scientific question in the absence of absolute proof. You use the scientific method to kind of approach the truth crabwise. The first thing you have to do is to check. And one of the ways you check in science is by doing experiments. And in 1859, at the Royal Institution in London, just 3 kilometers from where I'm broadcasting to you now, John Tyndall did a very careful experiment with quite an elaborate piece of equipment in which he put various greenhouse gases in a long cylinder and then shone light through that cylinder at various wavelengths, and then he took careful measurements of temperature of the air inside the cylinder to see at what temperature it was as a result of the different greenhouse gases with the same amount of light coming through it. And in that way, he was able to establish very clearly that certain gases, of which carbon dioxide was and is one, definitely cause warming. Now, when you are confronted with an experiment like that, which of course has itself been checked and replicated and repeated by many other people since, then it's no good coming along and waving your arms and saying, well, in theory, we don't like the idea that carbon dioxide causes warming, and we're going to pretend it doesn't. Because in practice, that has been checked, and we know by an experiment that you can relatively easily do in a laboratory at school or at university, that carbon dioxide in an atmosphere will cause warming. And even if we go right down to the quantum physics of how a greenhouse gas molecule interacts with a beam of radiant heat in the near infrared, we know that what happens is that an oscillation is set up at the quantum level in the molecule, and the result of that oscillation is to turn the molecule into a little radiator, which the radiation that interfaces with it switches on. So you're turning on lots of little radiators all through the atmosphere if you have a greenhouse gas there, and you shine light at the infrared wavelengths through it. And all of this is well established by multiple different kinds of experiment. And the trouble is that this particular group have tried to misuse various fundamental equations to suggest that the actual results which have been observed ought not to have been observed. The fact is, they were observed, and therefore there is no doubt about the fact that if you add a greenhouse gas to an atmosphere such as ours, which is largely not composed of greenhouse gases, then what will happen is that you get some warming. And you can even do quite elaborate experiments by going up into space and looking down with satellites and seeing at what wavelength is the light coming out from the Earth reaching the satellite. And you will find that at those wavelengths where we know that from laboratory experiment that CO2 and water vapor and methane and other greenhouse gases like that interfere with the outgoing radiation, less outgoing radiation at those wavelengths reaches the satellites than would reach them if there were no greenhouse gases there. So we can really do some quite sophisticated experiments, and these are done every day by the satellites, to demonstrate very, very clearly that there is a greenhouse effect. And indeed, without it, the planet would be quite a lot colder. The rough estimate is sort of 30 Celsius colder than it is today. It would be largely an ice planet, except around the equator. So we can be grateful to the greenhouse effect for keeping us warm. Now, of course, of that 30 Celsius, only a tiny amount is contributed by the carbon dioxide that we have added to the atmosphere since 1750. So shall I just stop there for a moment and ask if there is anyone in the class who still thinks that there is no such thing as greenhouse effect?
Anyone? You said there's no such thing as the greenhouse effect. Is that what you're asking?
I'm saying, is there anyone who believes that there is no such thing as a greenhouse in the class?
Is the greenhouse effect? We didn't catch the last part.
Is there anyone in the class who believes there is no such thing as a greenhouse effect?
Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Good.
No?
Well, you're quite right. There is a greenhouse effect. And as I say, it's been established by experiment. And so anyone who comes along and tries to say it isn't has either got to demonstrate by other experiments that the experiments are wrong, or show that the experiments didn't, in fact, demonstrate what we know they did demonstrate. So that, I hope, ends that aspect of the matter. So now the question is, how much warming will the enhancement of the greenhouse effect by adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere actually cause? Now, the amount of warming you will get, which is called the climate sensitivity, in response to, let us say, the doubling of carbon dioxide concentration this century that we would expect to see unless we control it in some way. If we carry on business as usual, we will double the CO2 concentration compared with today by the end of the century. How much warming will that cause? Well, there are three parameters or independent variables which, when multiplied together, give you that answer. First of these variables is called the radiative forcing from doubling the CO2 in the atmosphere. And the official value for that is around 3.7 watts per square meter of extra radiation coming in as opposed to going out at the top of the atmosphere as a result of the extra greenhouse gases which double the CO2 concentration. 3.7 watts per square meter. Now that in itself has already been reduced by 15% from the original 4.4 watts per square meter, which was the IPCC's first estimate in the first of its 4 climate assessment reports in 1990. They've already reduced that particular parameter by a whopping 15%. So when anybody tries to tell you the science is settled, which science is it? The 1990 report or the 2001 report in which this 15% reduction in that key parameter was made? We then go on to, you multiply the radiative forcing by what is called the Planck sensitivity parameter. And that is a number in Kelvin per watts per square meter, which converts the radiative forcing into temperature change before you take into any account of what are called temperature feedbacks, which we're going to come on in a moment. And that parameter, according to the IPCC, which has finally given us a value for it, only in a footnote on page 631 of its fourth assessment report, published in 2007, is around 0.31 Kelvin per watt per square meter. So if you multiply the 3.7 watts per square meter of radiative forcing by 0.31 Kelvin per watt per square meter, what you get is around 1 Celsius degree of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration. Now, virtually everybody on all sides of the debate accepts that that answer is insightful. So the real debate about the climate is not about whether CO2 is warming, not even about how much warming it causes in the absence of feedbacks. The answer is about 1 Celsius for a doubling of CO2. The real debate, where there is no consensus and there is no universal agreement among scientists, is on the extent to which warming of the climate by a force such as doubling CO2 concentration will itself trigger additional forcings because of changes in the atmosphere that occur because the atmosphere has become warmer. The most obvious of these is that as the atmosphere becomes warmer, it is capable of carrying near exponentially more water vapor, and water vapor by its sheer quantity is the most important of the greenhouse gases, far more important than CO2 itself. And the official storyline is that the feedback, these additional forcings that occur simply because the CO2 has caused the initial warming, and that warming has in turn triggered various behaviors in the atmosphere that give you additional forcing, that those additional forcings, which we call temperature feedbacks, will triple the original warming, causing not 1, but 3.26 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration. Now that, of course, is a much more serious proposition. If the world were to warm by that much over the next few hundred years, that would make some kind of a difference to how much ice there was around, what the sea level was, etc. It would make some difference. Probably not much difference, as the usual suspects pretend, but it would make some difference. But there are very powerful reasons, and many of these appear in the scientific literature, for doubting whether we would see a tripling of the original warming caused by CO2 as a result of these temperature feedbacks. And the most important of these reasons is that temperature feedbacks indicate a certain degree of instability in the climate, and in particular instability in the temperature response of the climate to an external perturbation, such as the radiative forcing from CO2. However, if we go back to the early climate, and we can go back about 64 million years, you're too young to remember, but if we go back that far, then 64 million years ago, we had a warming compared with today of around 8 Celsius degrees. Between then and now, there has been ice ages in which temperatures have gone about 8 Celsius below today. And today we're somewhere in the middle of that range. 8 Celsius up or down today is as much warming or cooling as we have seen in the whole of the last 64 million years. Now, of course, that is quite enough to give an ice age at one moment and a hothouse Earth at the next. However, in absolute terms, it means that we've only seen a 3% variation either side of the average temperature which has existed over the last 64 million years. Now that 3% variation, given all the different influences, with the sun changing its activity, the Earth changing the angle which it presents to the sun, the speed of its rotation, the obliquity of its axis, all these different major things going on, and yet the temperature throughout all that time has only varied by 3% up or down from its average. Now what this means is that there are formidable homeostatic processes. That's a long word means is that there are processes that tend to keep the temperature fairly stable. And if there are these strong homeostatic processes, so the temperature hasn't been changing very much, then that limits, and limits very severely, the magnitude of possible temperature feedbacks in the system today. And we can use the analogy of an electronic circuit. If you design an electronic circuit, then if you want it to remain stable, then you will not allow feedbacks to a loop gain of more than 0.01 to occur. And in a very strong circuit, in stable conditions, you might allow that to go to 0.1 at absolute maximum. But the loop gain in the climate system, imagined by the IPCC, is far bigger than 0.1. It's 0.4 to 0.8. Now, all this may sound rather technical, but the central point is that at anything like 0.4 to 0.8 for your closed-loop gain in the feedback system, you would have the danger of runaway occurring and eventually an oscillation occurring in time, which we know from our paleoclimate studies looking back at the climate simply hasn't been happening. And in effect, this means that the most warming we can really expect to see from a doubling of CO2 concentration is just 1 Celsius degree, 1.25 at most. So now that we've done a little bit of the theory, which raises questions about whether or not the usual suspects are correct in trying to triple the original warming from CO2 by including feedback as their excuse, we now need to do what the scientific method prescribes. We need to check the argument that I've just given you. Now, there are various ways this can be done. And one of the simplest, done by Professor Linson at MIT just a couple of years ago, was to get the data from the satellites on how fast the outgoing radiation changes in response to changes in surface temperature. And what he has found is that the rate at which the outgoing radiation change is consistent not with strongly positive feedbacks that amplify the original warming, but with quite strongly negative feedbacks that diminish it. And so his best estimate at the moment is that doubling of CO2 concentration will cause warming, but it will only cause about 0.7 Celsius of warming. And you can do the calculation another way. You can notice that although the models predict that there will be a certain rate of extra evaporation as the world gets warmer, and evaporation causes cooling, actually 3 times the more predicted rate of evaporation occurs from the surface with warming, and therefore 3 times the rate. And once again, you'd be looking at warming and 3. But there's another consideration, and that is that the IPCC itself only estimates that the amount of warming that we will cause this century by the CO2 that we add to the atmosphere this century is only 1.5 Celsius. That's because not all of the warming happens straight away. It happens over several hundred or even several thousand years. You only get around half of it happening straight away in the first century. So we're only looking at 1.5 Celsius of CO2-induced warming caused by us this century and occurring this century. Now, let's be fair. We have to add to that 0.6 Celsius, which they say is going to happen because of the greenhouse gases we have already added and where the warming hasn't come fully through. But we can't influence that, so economically speaking, that's of no interest to us. Likewise, they say that approximately another 0.7 Celsius will occur from methane and other greenhouse gases this century that we're adding, making around 2.8 Celsius of warming altogether. But all the policy measures that are being adopted to address the CO2 problem are concentrating only on that 1.5 Celsius of CO2 caused warming over the 21st century, and not on the other greenhouse gases. So that then leads us from the scientific considerations to the economic considerations. And supposing we were to accept, for the sake of argument, that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which gives the official view on this, is right, that we're going to see 1.5 Celsius of warming this century as a result of the CO2 we add to the atmosphere this century. Okay, let's accept that. The next question is, of the various measures to try to make that warming not happen, how much will each of them cost? How much warming will it make to go away, would otherwise occur? And set that cost against the cost of nothing, allowing the warming to happen, and dealing focused, adapting the focused way to any warming that occur and any adverse consequences. That is the correct economic analysis. And what is interesting is that when I went in to visit the British Department of Climate Change, an absurd title for a government department, a couple of years ago, I said to them, please show me your calculation, which will demonstrate how much global will go away in response to the 723 billion sterling, that's over $1 trillion, that your department is committed under the Climate Change Act, in the UK, to spend over the next 50 years. How much global warming will this prevent? And they said, we have never done any such calculation, and we do not know how to do that calculation. So I spent much of the last year and a half studying the answer to that question. And I have now developed a series of equations which accept the official storyline about how much warming we're going to get, and simply say, and also accept what the cost would be doing nothing, which is estimated by Lord Stern in his report of 2006. Accept all that, and then we say, all right, what difference is it going to make if we try to stop emitting CO2 by these various policies? And the bottom line is this, that it is between 10 and 100 times more expensive to try to stop it from happening of the damage if we sit back today and spend nothing now and let it happen. So here is the question for you as the future generation, which I'd love to hear your feedback on. The question is this: would you rather inherit vastly less because we have spent all the money on trying to make the warming away, or would you like to inherit much more and then spend a relatively small fraction of that on dealing with the relatively limited consequences of the warming that we cause if we don't act today to prevent it? You have to decide whether you want to waste your inheritance today, or whether you want to spend a very small proportion of it tomorrow on addressing the problem that we might waste inheritance on addressing today. That's the question. Hard-nosed, straightforward economic question. To address it satisfactorily needs some knowledge of the basic climatological equations that the Intergovernmental Panel and the consensus group of scientists follow. It also needs some knowledge of elementary macroeconomics, and very few people on the planet have expertise in these fields to bring these two fields together to produce the answers that I produced and presented at the Santa Fe Climate Conference, organized by the Los Alamos National Laboratory late last year. So, economically speaking, it is 10 to 100 times more expensive to spend money now on stopping global warming than it is to allow things to carry on and then address the consequences of warming in a focused way by sensible adaptation later. And there is a recent paper by Professor William Nordhaus of Yale University in which he says very clearly that correct strategy, economically speaking, even if you accept fully the amount of warming that the consensus group of scientists tells us to expect, is to do absolutely nothing for 50 years and spend not a cent for 50 years on trying to make global warming go away. That, economically speaking, is the correct strategy to follow. Now, my own calculations, independently, confirm his absolutely. That is, as best I can see it, right answer. I may still have a suspicion, I want to end on that, you may still have a suspicion that it's still going to be so terrible, whatever we spend now, however cost ineffective, we still owe it to the planet and our fellow creatures to spend it. Well, let's just have a look then at what has been happening in the real climate. I'm going to ask you some questions now. How many of you have seen it reported in any mainstream news media that for the last 14 years there has been no global warming at all? Hands up. Well,
So, has anyone, so in the past 40 years that there has been no warming?
last 14 years.
14. Well, I brought it up a few weeks ago. I brought up some of the data that has come out recently that suggests that there has been no warming. So I did bring that up in class. But
so you're familiar with that. Good. How many of you have seen it reported in any mainstream news medium that sea level over the last 8 years has been rising at a rate equivalent to 3 centimeters per century? And let me ask you this, how many of you, hands up, would regard a sea level rise of 3 centimeters per century as something to worry about? Precisely. So what we're seeing...
You couldn't see the whole class, but there were a few hands that did go up.
Well, forgive me, but let me give you the facts on how much sea level has been rising. Once again, we go back 11,400 years to the end of the last ice age, which happened very suddenly. And in the years since then, the average rate of sea level rise, long before we came along, was, or long before we could possibly have influenced it, was 1.3 meters per century. That was the average rate of sea level rise. And now the sea level is rising not at 1.3 meters, but by just 3 centimeters per century. Now that, I can assure you, is not a problem. Let us look at the Pacific atoll. You hear the Maldivian president, now sacked, fortunately, holding a cabinet meeting underwater to draw attention to the plight of the Pacific atolls. But Pacific atolls are made of coral, and coral grows to meet the light. And the reason why, after 130 meters of sea level rise over the last 11,400 years, all these Pacific atolls are exactly at sea level is not some amazing coincidence. It's because the corals have grown to meet the light. As the sea comes over them, up they grow to get back to the light again. And they've been doing this for all those millennia. So the last place you have to worry on Earth about sea level rise is a Pacific atoll. It's the one place you will definitely be absolutely fine.
I think one common problem that we come across is that you're citing this information now, right?
Yep.
For example, with there having not been warming in the past, significant warming in the past 14 years, and so I'll present this information, and then other perspectives will present a different set of data, and then it comes down to sort of like a he said, she said type deal, and then students question which set of information is correct, right?
Well,
And so that
this is where, in the end, you have to go and look at the data for yourselves to decide who's right. Now, if we go back 60 years to 1950, roughly, since then, there has been warming at a rate equivalent to 1.2 Celsius per century. Not the 2.8 Celsius predicted by the IPCC, 1.2. That's been the actual rate of warming. Why do I go back 60 years? I do that because there is a natural cycle of 30 years warming followed by 30 years cooling that goes on and on, known as the cycle of the ocean oscillations. And that cycle, if you take any period of less than 60 years, you may find that you have allowed that cycle to distort the position. If you go back, for instance, only 30 years from today, 20 years were in a warming cycle, only 10 in a cooling cycle of that natural oscillation, and that will distort the amount of warming you get. You have to go back 60 years to get the fair picture. The fair picture is that over those 60 years, warming has occurred, but at a rate of only 1.2 Celsius per century. And over the last 14 years, it doesn't matter which temperature data set you look at. They all show that there's either been no warming or a tiny bit of cooling or a very, very, very small bit of warming. They all show the same. There is no argument on that. So then we come to sea level rise, and the most modern of the satellites that's been up there for more than 5 years is the Envisat satellite, and you can go onto the Aviso Envisat website, and you can check for yourself what the rate of sea level rise shown by that satellite is. It's the only satellite that gives us near real-time data. It gives you updated data practically every day. And it will also provide for you a calculation of the least squares linear regression trend on the data since January 2004, when that satellite first went up. And what that shows is that the rate of increase in sea level is the equivalent of 3 centimeters per century. That's how fast it's rising. And that's not fast. That is not a problem. That is so far within the measurement error that it might even be no sea level rise at all. It's certainly nothing whatsoever to worry about, and it certainly doesn't justify the spending of trillions of dollars on shutting down the economies of the West, which is being advocated by the UN and the communist parties worldwide. So that's the sea level, and it's the big one, because if there isn't much in the way of sea level rise, then most of the other scares that are whipped up in the name of worrying about climate change don't really rate. You may, for instance, have heard that the ice is melting. Well, already the IPCC has got egg all over its face for telling us there will be no more ice in the Himalayas in just by the Indian Geological Survey, from which I get my information on the ice, shows that there's been no change in the amount of ice in the Himalayas over the whole of the last 30 years since the satellites were able to watch. And then there's the Arctic, where there has been quite a considerable loss of sea ice, but only over the 30 years the satellites have been able to watch. It is likely, though we can't say one way or the other definite, that there was less sea ice in the Arctic in the 1920s and 30s than there is today. Reports by the US Meteorological Service at that time showed very large expanses of ice where even today, of open water, where even today we would find ice. So we can't say for sure the loss of sea ice in the Arctic is unprecedented. We can say that over the 30 years the satellites have been watching, it has happened. But it has been almost fully matched by an increase in the amount of sea ice which has been cooling throughout the 30 years during which the satellites have been watched. And if you only go on about the Arctic sea ice loss, and you don't mention the growth in the Antarctic sea ice at the same time, then you're not giving or understanding the full picture. Then, of course, there's the land-based ice, both in the Antarctic and in Greenland. Those are the two big masses of land-based ice, where we are told that vast amounts of ice are pouring into the ocean because of global warming. Now, here's the question. If these vast amounts of ice are pouring into the ocean because of global warming, where is all that water going? Why do I ask that question? because Aviso Envisat tells us that there has been practically no sea level rise over the last 8 years. So if all that water was being filled up by ice coming off the land, then it's clearly not making very much difference to sea level. And so by these very simple logical methods, you can yourself go and look at the data. Go and look at the Aviso Envisat temperature, the sea level rise record, and then say to yourself, okay, so where is all this ice that's been melting? If it really has been melting. It clearly, even if it has been melting, it doesn't make very much difference to sea ice. Let's take a paper by Johannes et al. From Denmark in 2009, writing about the Greenland ice sheet. He said 273 billion tons of ice had gone into the ocean between roughly 2005 and 2009. So I did a sum to work out how much sea level rise worldwide would occur as a result of 273 billion tons of ice going from Greenland into the ocean. And the answer is that it caused the sea level to rise by 0.7 millimeters. That is all. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that however exciting the storyline about terrifying change as a result of global warming may be, it is better to be very careful to check the data and ask the sensible questions. Since sea level is not really rising at all at the moment, then we know that whatever ice is going into the oceans is not making much difference to it. And therefore we may have much less of a problem than the usual suspects have been trying to tell us. And it's very important then, that in the end, rather than listening to some side and then kind of checking, you go, if you're interested in this question, and look at the actual data. All of it is available online. It isn't necessarily easy to find, but it is all available online. You can go and check it. You can do the calculations and stuff for yourself, get your teacher to help you. And then, once you've done that, you will find it very much harder to worry about global warming being a serious problem. Because one thing is becoming quite clear. The IPCC made a forecast in its 1990 first assessment report of how fast the global warming until now would be. And it gave a maximum and a central estimate and a minimum estimate. And the actual amount of warming that has occurred since 1990 is below the minimum estimate supplied by the IPCC. So their forecast skill has been demonstrated before, and their forecasts have been shown to be quite substantial exaggeration. And we should therefore be very careful not to spend taxpayers' money, which is badly needed to alleviate poverty and disease in countries that so badly need our help, including Mexico. We should not divert money away from that towards what is obviously the non-problem of global warming. And with that, I'll be very happy to take your question.
Okay, if we could just switch a little bit to discuss the political and economic implications. We've been reading some of the Copenhagen conference reports, the summaries, the Cancun, Mexico, and we've been reading a bit from the upcoming Rio +20 summit. And we're looking at some of the documents, and they discuss like a total transformation of, well, they have the three pillars, right? The society, economy, and environment. And then we read a Wall Street Journal article citing you called "Has Anyone Read the Copenhagen Agreement?" where you discuss, here's just a section from the 180-page draft, where they discuss creating a global government and financial mechanisms, which include wealth taxes, currency exchange tax, all sorts of global levies. Perhaps if you can discuss your experience at Copenhagen, and it seems these conferences build upon each other. From Copenhagen and then Cancun, they're discussing the Green Climate Fund, Durban.
Durban, exactly. Yes, and then Rio, and then Qatar, and so it goes on. It's a wonderful gravy train for bureaucrats and politicians. These endless international conferences about the non-problem of the climate in various exotic holiday destinations like Durban and Rio and so forth. But let's go to Copenhagen and start, since you referred to that. Copenhagen was the conference at which the international Marxist left, which has been really driving this climate scare from the political aspect, hoped that it would get away, finally, with introducing the Socialist International, as they call it, in the shape of a global government. And in the draft treaty of Copenhagen, produced by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and published on its website and dated the 15th of September 2009, at Annex 1, paragraphs 36 and 38, the word government is mentioned in a context which is quite plainly intended to be a global government. Now, hands up all those of you who think that whether a government is local, national, regional, or global, it should be elected by the peoples it serves. So most of you, I think, believe in democracy. The big problem in these various climate treaties and proposals to establish a global government is that in the 186 pages of that global government treaty, there was not one word about you and me, the peoples of the world, having the right to elect the people who would in future govern us. Now, Mexico has a democracy, America has one, Britain used to have one. We are now governed by a committee of technocrats in Brussels who make 5/6 of our laws. We can't elect them, we are no longer a democracy. But democracy is, to my mind, a valuable and welcome and just way of governing.
Well, we've got a few Brits here that are laughing.
I should think they are. It's a very sad situation that now 5/6 of our laws, according to an official German government estimate, are made by people we do not elect. Whatever else that is, whatever other merits it may have, it is not democracy. And so my contention is that we now face, at the constitutional level, a crisis of democracy, because increasingly it is seen as sensible, and I don't say this is wrong, it's seen as sensible, that nations should cooperate together in matters such as the environment, which are obviously of common concern to the whole of humanity. And it's increasingly likely that intergovernmental agencies of one kind or another, with executive power, the power to make laws and impose taxes, will be brought into being. That's what the Copenhagen Treaty says. That's what the Cancun Treaty provides details of. It creates 1,000 new world government bureaucracies. And then the Durban process was going to establish an international criminal climate court, and it was going to give rights of legal personality to Mother Earth. Can you imagine anything as half-baked as that? And it was going to require that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, at least on one of the options included in the draft discussion document, which was supposed to be the conclusions of the conference, to 200 parts per million, compared with around 400 now. That would be so low that plants and trees would greatly lose their productivity, many of them would die, and mass starvation would result worldwide. This was being seriously advocated at the climate conference in Durban. So we're getting a lot of gesture politics at these international conferences, rather than confronting the real problems of the world, which are infectious disease in third world countries and consequent poverty in third world countries, which could be eradicated. Poverty is no longer necessary in this world. It could be done away with if, instead of wasting the collaborative energy that has been created via these international conferences to talk about the non-problem of climate, if that could be redirected so as to talk about the real problems of poverty in the poorer countries, of disease, and the eradication of those, and the provision of decent health, welfare, education, food and water supplies, and safe sewerage treatment for countries that do not now have these things. That would be an achievable, affordable, commendable, justifiable, and moral objective. Whereas what is being done now is a grab for absolute power by the world's governing elite, which has grown tired of democracy and wishes to see the back of it. It doesn't want the voters to be telling it what to do anymore. So there is a real danger that we will get a centralized government power in the world using the non-problem of climate as the excuse, which will take away democracy itself, step by step, in the same way as it was taken away in Britain. We still have elections. We still elect our governments, but they're not our government anymore, only in name, because the government is the body that makes your law and imposes your tax. And now, 5/6 of our laws are imposed on us in Britain and in other European countries by the unelected commissars, that's the official German name for them, of the European Union. Why do I mention that in your context? Well, because that model of concentrating all real political power outside the hands of the voters, I'm carrying the pen with which I vote, they are taking that away from us. They're saying, no, now, in future, the UN is going to make itself into world government using the climate as the pretext, and it will take away our powers to decide our future by the ballot box. So what's my answer to this growing problem, crisis for democracy? It is not that we should sweep away the UN or the other institutions of friendly global collaboration that are gradually becoming sinister and self-serving institutions of dictatorship. Instead, we should make sure that the UN and the EU are in future elected bodies, and that no power can be wielded by unelected civil services or bureaucrats. The only power that can be wielded must be in the hands of those whom we, the peoples of the world, elect together. That is my modest proposal.
Okay. Perhaps you could just make a comment. We debated a section from the Cancun climate documents where they discuss the implementation of relocation programs for human settlements and infrastructure in high-risk areas. And so there was a bit of debate. What do you think they meant by that?
They chiefly mean, I've talked to them about this, and what they chiefly mean by that is that if sea level rises, then the very large number of coastal cities, London, New York, Shanghai, Amsterdam, these cities would be at risk of rising sea level if the sea level were at all likely to rise at the sort of rates that the extremists have predicted. But what has begun to happen is that even the usual suspects have begun to realize that sea level isn't going to rise that fast. It's already slowing down, so that there was less, sea level was actually lower in 2011 than it was in any of the previous 7 years. And sea level is not rising at the rate they predicted it would. And already the UN has reduced its maximum estimate of sea level rise over the whole of the 21st century to 2,100 from 3 feet, that's around a meter, I'm trying to think, to 2 feet, which is 60 centimeters. They brought that maximum right down. But the best estimate I can obtain of how sea level will change over the next century is from the former chairman of the INQUA Sea Level Commission, Professor Niklas Mörner of Stockholm, who knows more about this than anybody else alive and has written some 550 papers, nearly all of them on this subject in the peer-reviewed literature. And his estimate is that sea level will rise by 5 centimeters this century, plus or minus 15 centimeters. There's some uncertainty, but it's going to be small either way. It rose by approximately 20 centimeters, we think, in the 20th century. That's about 8 inches if you're American or British. It's not a lot. And if anything, the rate of sea level rise is now slowing rather than accelerating. So that, frankly, all this talk about we need to arrange for resettlement of people who are living along the coast, this is now seen increasingly by governments as the nonsense it always was. Now, of course, there will always be climate refugees. The problem with the climate is that it does change, and it changes catastrophically in various directions all the time, nothing to do with us. And therefore, there will always be sudden climatic disasters like the floods in Pakistan last year, the droughts in Russia last year, which actually had the same cause. It was called a blocking high, which is a well-known meteorological phenomenon, nothing to do with global warming. The very cold winters we have had in Britain for the last 3 years are also caused by blocking highs, which have become more frequent recently in the way that they do at this particular point in the 60-year cycle of the ocean oscillations. There's nothing unknown or unusual about this. So this idea that there are going to be vast numbers of climate refugees and resettlement programs will have to be put in place, that needs to be redirected towards the far more serious likelihood that there will be large numbers of political refugees from the dictatorial regimes around the world that do not allow the voters to decide how their country will be run, but impose upon them hideous cruelties of various kinds. That is much more likely to create, and has created, very large numbers of refugees, and that is far more likely even than naturally occurring climate disasters to cause refugees, because in any well-governed country, it is possible to survive even the most hideous climatic disaster by simply being well organized about it. Look at Japan following the tsunami. That was a big disaster, climate-related, nothing to do with global warming, obviously. It caused 50,000 deaths, but the Japanese coped with it because they are a democratic and efficient country. It's the dictatorships that are bad at dealing with climate disasters. That's where you're going to get refugees, from the dictators who do not govern their countries properly and exploit their citizens and imprison them in a poverty which ought not to be their birthright. And we're going to have to start toughening up our stance against the world's dictators and replacing them one by one with democracies. And while we're doing that, what we don't want is that behind our backs, the EU, the UN, the World Law, the Sea Conference, all these other international bodies should start taking away democracy from us by stealth. We have to make sure that we keep democracy going, because then there will be a far smaller refugee problem. And the fact is that sea level rise is not going to cause the refugee problem that the UN was talking of. I mean, only a few years ago, the UN, entirely for self-serving reasons, was openly stating, and was being echoed with approval in the Marxist newspapers, The Guardian in the UK, The Independent, the New York Times, the LA Times. They were all quoting this figure, that there would be hundreds of millions of climate refugees by 2010 because of sea level rise caused by global warming. Well, it hasn't happened. It simply hasn't happened. This prediction, like so many other of the absurdly exaggerated predictions which have misled so many young people around the world, has not come to pass. And we now know from the near real-time data from the Envisat satellite that it isn't happening, and we can infer from that that it isn't going to happen. That is a non-problem, and it is being wasting the time and taxpayers' money in addressing it. We need to move on and deal with the real and immediate problems of poverty and disease.
You mentioned our possibility to eliminate poverty today, and if you can just briefly comment, if you have any insight. We were going to discuss genetically modified food in the near future, and the relation between the effects on the environment of GMO crops and the connection to sustainable development. Because some people say that the GM crops will help feed more people, but then there are obvious health risks as well as the consolidation of the global food monopolies like Monsanto.
Well, the interesting thing is you say the health risks are obvious. They're not at all clear to me. In Britain, we have been selectively breeding race horses to improve the quality of the stock and the speed and stamina of the racehorse for generations. That is genetic modification. Now, it's also now being done with plants, as again we have been doing in our gardens and in our fields, for hundreds of years in Britain, and we are one of the healthiest races on earth. The idea that just because you seek to exploit the genetic sequence that is in all life in a way that removes defects and enhances, say, crop yields, this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And the idea that if we cause alterations that nature might otherwise have caused anyway, but might have taken a lot longer to do it, this is somehow a bad thing, is not so far supported. I mean, I haven't studied the literature on this as closely as I have the literature on climate change, so I may now be talking out of turn and talking beyond what I strictly know. But I cannot recall any clear evidence that large numbers of deaths have been caused anywhere in the world by the fact that crops had been genetically mutated by us. I simply don't know of any instance of that. Now, that may be, as I say, ignorance on my part. But if it hasn't happened so far, given the many centuries for which these alterations in the genetic behavior of plants and of animals have been practiced, I think we can take it that the risks in that direction, though not zero, because any change, it carries with it a risk that it may be a change too far. I can't say, therefore, there is no risk. What I can say is that as far as the evidence is to date, the risk of any serious harm being done to anyone or anything by these genetic modifications is very, very low.
Okay, before I switch to the students now for a few of their questions, I thought I'd just make one comment that you might find interesting. Reading from the literature of the UN, this is from Rio, the future we want for in June. It's interesting how they mentioned the need to teach sustainable development as a module across all disciplines. And here at our institution, you know, there's we've been handed diagrams such as these where show that this is it's being put into effect. It's kind of interesting to know how far along some of these policies are, and they are being put across the different careers here at our institution.
Well, certainly this phrase, sustainable development, was developed by originally the KGB, the Russian communist secret police, as a method of undermining the economic performance of the Western nations with which communist countries like the Soviet Union were wholly unable to compete. And so their strategy was to go for the soft underbelly of the Western economies, which is energy supply. They themselves had very big difficulties in maintaining enough energy supply to develop their economy. They knew, therefore, that if they could attack our energy supply, then that would very much help bring down the economies of the West. So the origins of this idea of sustainable development, coyly fascinating and nice and good though it may sound, are highly unpleasant and are rooted in some of the most implacable enemies of the West, enemies that have now been removed, but the ideas they have left behind have taken new life, and the former communists have regrouped into the environmental movement to carry on the attack against capitalism and the West from there. Now, you may think that all sounds absurdly extreme, so let me give you the evidence. I had a friend, the late Eric Ellington, who was one of the original founders of Greenpeace. Now, Greenpeace has now become an enormous capitalist monster. It actually, together with the Worldwide Fund for Nature and Environmental Defense Fund, spent $1 billion last year on environmental propaganda for the climate change thing and for sustainable development and these other largely communistic ideas. And Eric was not a politician. He was not a politico. He was not a communist. He wasn't any kind of politico. He genuinely cared about the environment, as did all the original founders of Greenpeace. And they all left within a few years because in came the Marxists and took it over. That was what he told me. Now, one of his co-founders of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore, has gone public and said what Eric has been saying to me privately, that Greenpeace is essentially a communist front organization. Now it's been captured by people who are exploiting the natural desire to protect the environment, particularly on the part of young people, and using that and perverting it for nakedly Marxist political ends. Now, that all may sound terribly extreme when you say it as bluntly as I say it, but I'm saying it a lot less bluntly than Eric Ellington, one of the founders of Greenpeace, said it to me. And this whole notion of sustainable development, when you stand back and look at it, it is just yet another way of attacking the West's energy supplies and the West's desire to continue to expand economically. Now, of course, there always has to be a balance between man and nature. We cannot crush under our heel our fellow creatures and the plants and trees. We can't cut them all down, cut them all off, kill them all off, and leave ourselves only on this planet. It will be a lonely place without plants and animals with whom we live and on whom we live. So, of course, there must be a just balance in all, a just weighting between our desire to develop economically and our desire to make sure that our beautiful planet stays beautiful and that we do not crowd out our fellow creatures, we do not overfish the oceans, we do not cut down the rainforests. All these, the deforestation, the overfishing of the oceans, pollution of the oceans, pollution on the land, pollution of the air, these are real environmental problems which we can address both as individual nations and collectively. And once again, for far smaller amounts of money than we would have to spend on the climate problem. But you do not need to have an entire, monstrous, centrally driven, sustainable development agenda to do this. After all, it was in fact the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom that passed the first Clean Air Act just about anywhere in the world in 1956. And that was done not because of the KGB said so. It was done because we realized it was a matter of common sense that we should have air enough that it didn't go around killing people in their thousands every time we got a fog. So there are sensible balances to be struck. And I am becoming very nervous of the idea of allowing the UN to centralize power in its own hands and then go around issuing, as it has, the so-called Agenda 21 program, which socialist administrations and communist administrations all over the world are eagerly implementing, and thereby they're shutting down private businesses operating in their area and driving them out. And that makes all of us poor. There has to be a more careful balance. And I am hoping, therefore, that at RIA, some extreme proposals that are already being put forward by the communist parties and the Green parties, who are more or less coextensive these days, will be defeated, and that a more moderate and balanced approach to the environment is taken, which focuses in particular on the really serious problems only where they are serious. Deforestation is not a serious problem in Britain because it's already happened a long time ago. We can't do anything about it now. But in the rainforest, we can help Brazil and, to some extent, Mexico and other countries that have rainforests to make sure that they are able to protect the rainforest so that the economic pressures to cut them down and economic rewards for cutting them down are reduced and removed. Those are sensible measures that can be taken. But the idea that we should effectively implement Communist Party policies in every local authority and every nation in the world for the sake of the environment, that is the idea which is essentially behind the Sustainable Development Agenda, and that is one which I submit we should reject in favour of a more balanced, more careful, and more politically neutral approach.
Okay, and so let's see if some of you have questions. You can ask directly or from where you're seated, and I'll repeat them. You want to come up to? Perhaps you can just take a seat over here and ask him.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
So, I read one of your articles that was published in the Telegraph in 2006.
Yeah.
It was titled "Wrong Problem, Wrong Solution," and in it you said that mitigation was I quote you, expensively futile without the consent of the third world's fast-growing nations.
Yeah.
And I just wondered what you thought it would take to obtain such consent from such a large portion of the world's population other than powerful scientific evidence?
Right. Well, the first thing is that the scientific evidence is doubtful in the ways I've described, and that even if we accept the consensus view, and of course you should never accept a consensus merely because it's a consensus, that would not be logical, but even if we accept the consensus view, under all circumstances that I have so far investigated economically, it is not cost effective to mitigate global warming. It's better to adapt to it by an order of magnitude or two, or sometimes even three. It's really very, very much better, sometimes even 1,000 times better, more cost effective to adapt to any warming and its consequences than to try to prevent it. Now, the question of the third world countries is really this. They have to develop, because if they want to stabilize their populations, they have to make sure that those populations become wealthier. That is the only way you can effectively stabilize a population, by bringing up its general level of prosperity. Then it stabilizes without the need for any enforcement, without the need for killing children in the womb or any other of the hideous things that go on. You don't need any of that, provided you make them prosperous. The fastest way to make them prosperous is by fossil-fueled electricity. It is the cheapest and most reliable form of electricity generation to this day. While that remains the case, the third world countries, more than anything else, are going to want to follow the lead in Africa, of South Africa, for instance, and install electricity. 60% of the electricity generated in Africa is generated in and for South Africa, of which 80% now has electricity. That shows you how little electricity there is in the rest of Africa. And while they don't even have electricity, they can't have proper hospitals, they can't have proper healthcare, they can't have proper businesses, they can't run computers, they can't do any of the things we take for granted. So we have to lift them out of poverty, and that means that in the first step they are going to want to do, and it's right that they should, is to use fossil fuels to get electricity to the vast majority of Africa, for instance, that doesn't have it. Same in China, where the vast majority of China still doesn't have electricity. And they need it, and they know they need it, and they are building, quite unashamedly, 1 or even 2 coal-fired power stations, big ones and not very clean ones either, every week. And they're doing this because it's absolutely necessary that they should lift their people out of poverty, or their people ultimately will not sustain their regime and will require a different kind of regime. The regime knows it has to deliver economically, and if it's to do that, it must lift them out of poverty so as to stabilize the population. And for these very powerful reasons, I do not expect any of the third world nations to be at all convinced by the rather apocalyptic noises made in the name of, but not by, the scientific consensus. The scientific consensus is not that global warming is going to be terrible. It is that we need to watch it, we need to check, but we don't need actually to take any action now. The economic consensus is near unanimous in saying that it's better not to take any action for around a year. It's there. And those are the scientific facts of the consensus. It's not what the Communist Party is telling you, it's not what the Green Party, which is much the same thing, is telling you. The truth of it is that economically speaking, it really is better to do nothing now, and therefore the third world countries should not feel under any pressure, and on the whole do not feel under any pressure to make any radical change in the way they generate their electricity. I do expect the more advanced of them will make more use of nuclear power, and that's very sensible because the modern generation of nuclear power stations, unlike the 40-year-old power stations at Fukushima, for instance, the sort of disasters that happened there couldn't happen in a modern nuclear power station. They've been completely redesigned so that that kind of thing is no longer possible. So nuclear power is clearly a way to go for those who still worry about the amount of warming that CO2 is likely to cause. On the data I've seen, I don't worry about it anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore because the facts have changed, so my opinion has changed. But if one is still worried about that, then one should assist the third world countries to use nuclear technology, which is the safest and the cleanest. And indeed, if you do it the way the French have done it, on a very large scale, getting a design that's workmanlike and then rolling it out 100 times, it's also the cheapest electricity in the world. And that would be my solution if I were worried about CO2. since I'm not worried about CO2, then I would be in favour of going for continuing to burn coal and gradually shifting from that to natural gas, shale gas, and eventually even the methane hydrates which are available beneath the permafrost, where there's vast quantities of methane ready to be tapped and turned into power and warmth for humanity. So I don't see this anymore as really any kind of a problem, either economic or scientific or climatological. It's entirely manageable. We don't face the apocalyptic future that the Greens and the Communists have tried to advocate. That is now quite clearly simply not on the cards. Check that sea level figure as really the most outstanding example of this. It really isn't happening. And therefore, I don't think that it would be right to try to put pressure on third world countries to abandon the cheapest and most reliable form of electricity, and therefore the cheapest and most reliable way of lifting their people out of poverty and thereby stabilizing their populations, because that, in the long run, will be far more environmentally beneficial than trying to address the non-problem of global warming.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Your last chance to send a question to Lord Monckton. Melissa? Is it short?
What's the point of making people believe that we can do something about it? Because, I mean, all the presidents of the powerful nations, they know all the stuff.
So she's asking, well, what's the... Here, why don't you just come to them? It's more difficult to repeat. Hold on a second. And maybe the few of you, if you have any questions, get them ready.
Hi. So what's the point of making people believe that we can do something about it? Because, I mean, the presidents of all the nations probably know all of this. So why do they choose the alarmist side instead of just going ahead and helping the developing countries and all that?
Well, let me ask you a question. Why are mini skirts in fashion one year and long skirts in fashion the next year? The fact is that global warming at the international political level at the moment is a fashion statement. If you want to be seen as cool and get on with your mates in other countries who are world leaders, then you all pretend that global warming is a terribly serious problem and that we must address it and so on and so forth. It's simply a fashion statement. Increasingly, they realize now that they jumped onto this bandwagon just as the wheels were falling off. They got too overexcited. I mean, I've just gone back and read a speech that was given by Margaret Thatcher, if you go back to 1988, and she gave a speech to the Royal Society announcing the funding for the organization that now gives Britain the expertise that I said it should acquire in this field, which is the Hadley Centre. And she said at that time, it wasn't I who wrote the speech, I'm glad to say, but she said that she expected that unless we did something about CO2, it would cause temperatures to rise by 1 Celsius degree every 10 years. Now that is actually 10 times the rate we're now likely to get. And so people, even Margaret Thatcher, who has since, like me, changed her mind, got very excited by this at the early stage. And the honest ones, like Margaret Thatcher, and I hope like me, have changed their minds because they've seen that the evidence doesn't support this alarmist view. But you see, a lot of politicians and bureaucrats have almost staked their careers on saying that this is the gravest problem the world has ever faced, and we are here at the historic juncture as the politicians who will take charge, close down the economies of the West, impose savage new taxation and regulation, create a world government of which we will be in charge, end democracy forever. We will achieve this historical result. And they can't now. They've dug themselves in so far. They can't back off without losing face. So it's a combination of a fashion statement and a fear of being made to look ridiculous when they finally admit, as they will one by one have to admit, as Margaret Thatcher and I already have done, that we were fooled, that this was premature to assume there was going to be a very large problem. It's now quite evident that there isn't going to be a very large problem. It simply isn't happening as they predicted that by now it would have happened. We haven't had 100 million climate refugees, as the UN was trying to tell us only a few years ago that we would by now. We haven't had sea level rising at the rate they predicted. The ocean heat content is rising at less than a quarter of the rate they predicted. Temperature is rising at below the very lowest estimate that they predicted in 1990 of where it should be today. All of these forecasts have actually not come to pass. They have got it wrong. And the politicians don't like to admit that they, instead of doing their own job and thinking this through for themselves, allowed the experts to tell them what the right answer was. So then they could say, well, we're not the experts are all telling us this, therefore we must do what the experts say. Now, of course, any politician who automatically goes along with what the experts say is doing himself out of a job. Who needs politicians? We've got plenty of experts, goodness knows. Let's cut out the middleman, let's do away with the politicians, if all they will do is drift along with the consensus, drift along with the experts. No, in science, what we do is we check. We check and check and check again, as Al Haytham put it. Now, the politicians don't like doing it. They like hearing the experts give them clear and easy answers, saying there's going to be a terrible problem, and then in come the politicians and they can put up our taxes and increase regulation, and even tell us what kind of light bulbs we can and cannot use. Even the president of Mexico is terribly excited at the idea of saying you can't use the nice, bright, incandescent light bulbs. You've got to use these dismal, flickering, mercury-filled things that gradually get dimmer and dimmer over the years, and if you drop one, it's a major international environmental incident. So what we've got to do is to say to our politicians, look, come off it, we've had enough of this, stop poncing around the world, going to these fancy international conferences and pretending to be all worried about climate change. It's blindingly obvious now that it isn't happening, and the politicians are going to have to adjust to that fact, as in some countries, such as Canada, such as half of the United States, half of the UK now, the centre-right parties are beginning to wake up to the fact they were fooled by this. And it's only the parties of the hard left that are clinging by their fingernails to this global warming story because it achieves their political end of bringing the prosperity of the capitalist West and its democracy and its freedom and its sheer success and fun to an end.
Thank you.
Any final questions? You just mentioned all the governments that are sort of 50-50 now on climate change, but in Australia we're just implementing a carbon tax. So I just wanted to get your opinion on a carbon tax and yeah, like in the context of Australia.
Well, I've been to Australia and the carbon tax is entirely necessary, and it would cost between 20 and 100 times more to stop global warming by carbon taxes worldwide on the Australian model than it would to do nothing, sit back, enjoy the sunshine, and adapt in a focused way to any adverse consequences of any warming that may occur. 20 to 100 times more expensive to take action via a carbon tax than to do nothing. It is one of the most senseless pieces of interference and of unnecessary spending and unnecessary diversion of effort that I have ever seen any government perpetrate. It is lunacy, and I'm afraid there's no other word for it. It has been done entirely for international socialist, partisan, political reasons. There is no scientific basis for it. There is still less economic basis for it, but they've done it anyway because they're in power for the time being. Opposition in Australia has made it very clear over and over again that they will repeal the tax. Unconstitutionally, the socialist government has acted as communists do everywhere. It has tried to make sure that it prevents future parliaments undoing the measures it has produced, quite contrary to the principle no parliament can or should bind its successors. The will of the people must be expressed in each parliament. But the communists don't care about that, and essentially you now have a communist prime minister. She was a communist in her youth, and in many respects she still is. And I think it's deeply unfortunate that in the 19,000-page bill that introduced this hideous complex tax, she should have sought to bind future parliaments to make sure that they have to keep that tax completely unnecessary and economically damaging and environmentally irrelevant, though it is. So Australia is one of the few countries in the world, the goody two-shoes EU being another, that have actually introduced this carbon tax nonsense. In the EU, it has now failed 4 times in succession. It is about to fail for a 5th, and what I hope will be a final time. It is a very, very stupid measure, and quite rightly the people of Australia have resented it and resisted it, and I think it is going to make it rather hard for socialists and communists to be elected to power again in Australia as a result of their espousal of this plainly irrelevant and profoundly damaging tax.
Any final questions? Camilla? We have another Australian.
Sure.
What about Australia? Hello. This is just about, I read that you quite strongly wrote against, for example, before Copenhagen, they were saying something about a global governance, and you were very, very adamant that this was, in a quote you said, going to sign away freedom, democracy, and prosperity forever. On the other hand, someone like Lydia Baker, who works for Save the Children, has said that the world leaders, by not signing the contract for Copenhagen and making a global governance, have signed a death warrant for many of the world's poorest children. Can you give your perspective on the difference in these two opinions?
Right. First thing is that quite clearly, if you read the Copenhagen Treaty draft, Annex 1, paragraph 36 and 38, you will see that they were indeed going to establish a global government.
I understand that.
Find you anywhere else in the rest of that document to find any provision which allows us, the people, to vote for who should be the people in that government. It isn't there.
But
and
do you honestly...
was also going to be given, this is in the draft, was going to be given absolute powers of environmental control in all the member states of the UN Framework Convention. It was going to be given absolute power to raise whatever taxes in those countries it chose to raise, and several different methods of raising those taxes were mentioned in the draft. It was also going to be given the power to enforce its will by direct intervention of any form, including military, if it wished to do so, in order to make sure that the nations who didn't elect it and had no control over it, but were nonetheless subject to it, were made to do what they were told, whether being told what they were told to do was at all desirable or necessary environmentally or in any other way. It is absolutely plain from the text of that treaty that that is what was envisaged. And since you come from Australia, let me tell you what happened when a TV station in Melbourne saw what I had said in my speech about the Copenhagen Treaty. They went to a barrister and they said, is Monckton right about all this? Are they trying to set up a world government? Is it going to take away our democracy, our prosperity, and our freedom? And the QC, for he was a senior barrister, looked at it for some weeks, and then he got back to the TV station and he said, no, Monckton is wrong. It is far, far worse than what he has said. This is, he said, I'll put it bluntly, it is an attempt at a grab for absolute power by the world's governing class to the detriment of the voters. He said, that's what it's all about, and it should be bluntly said, and Monckton has been too polite. He hasn't said it bluntly enough. Now let's look about the other side of the coin. The world's children. What a lovely, emotive phrase. So let me tell you what the Environmental Defence Fund, one of the three big organizations, the big capitalist organizations, which between them spent $1 billion last year on environmental propaganda. Let me tell you what they did when 40 years ago, their lawyer advising them on their campaign, then just beginning, to have DDT, the only effective agent against the malaria mosquito, banned. He said to them, gentlemen, I beg you, I've looked at this, and you don't need to ban DDT outright. Allow it to be used inside people's houses. That's where the mosquitoes get in at night and bite. If you have the DDT in there, it won't get out into the environment, and even if it does any harm to the environment, which is highly questionable, it can't do any if you allow the DDT to be used only internally. Please, therefore, don't press for an outright ban, because if you do, millions of our children will die. Now, at that time, because DDT was in near universal use around the world against malaria. It is the only effective agent against the mosquito to this day. There were 50,000 deaths from malaria every year, mostly children, because malaria is chiefly a killer of children, as you may know. The ban, however, was introduced in a blanket form, so that you couldn't even use DDT inside your hut or your house in Africa or anywhere else. And when the chairman of the board of the Environmental Defence Fund heard Mr. Yannicone, their lawyer at the time, saying this to them, saying to the board, look, please don't try to ban it outright, just ban it for exterior use, otherwise the children are going to die in their millions. This is what the chairman said. He said, you're fired, now get out. And as Yannicone went to the door, he heard the chairman say to the rest of the meeting, that's the last time we ever employ a lawyer who knows anything about science. Now, what was the result of this cynical communist proposal to do away with the use of DDT? I'll tell you what it did. The number of deaths of our children, to use your emotive phrase, from malaria has risen from 50,000 per year while DDT was in use to 1.25 million per year. That was the figure announced last week by the UN Malaria Programme. Because even though Dr. Arata Kochi of the World Health Organization lifted the ban on malaria publicly by a press release and a statement on the 15th of September 2006, and in doing so he said, in this field, politics usually comes first and science second. We will now take a stand on the science and the data, and we will make DDT once again the first line of defense for our children against the mosquito. He was not heeded, because the international communist left, once it had decided that DDT was going to be its target, would never, ever admit that our children were being killed by the million. 40 million children have been killed because the Environmental Defence Fund said that it wasn't going to have only a partial ban, it wanted a blanket ban on DDT. So if you really want to help our children, then it is probably now time to ban the Environmental Defence Fund, ban Greenpeace, ban the Worldwide Fund for Nature and their unscientific and explicitly communist approach to these things, and then our children will perhaps stand a chance of life that is being denied to them by the tens of millions now.
Can I just ask a question then? You keep on saying the communist view has killed all of these children. I would say that the patent, I'm getting echoed. The patents on AIDS drugs, for example, I would say is a capitalistic system. And how many children has that killed in Africa?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Did you say how many children has capitalism killed in Africa?
I was drawing the example of the patents on the AIDS drugs, which I would say is a capitalistic system. Which is
right. What you're trying to suggest, I think, is that because the holders of the patents on the very expensive to develop HIV drugs have not transferred the right to use these drugs without any payment at all to Africa, therefore they're killing people in Africa. Now let's look at this the other way around, in the non-communist perspective, if I may. It costs a lot of money to develop a medication against HIV. I know, because I'm working on one at the moment, which shows some promise. It's very expensive. I've had to sell my house to fund the next stage of research. I have to live at the moment wherever I can find somewhere to lay my head. That's what it costs for a capitalist to do this. It's very, very expensive. It's very chancy. The licensing regime is very difficult. It can cost billions to get a workable drug that is proven safe onto the market. Now, if you are to say to the people who are doing this development, you're not going to be rewarded even if you succeed, then how can I keep a roof over my head? Are you going to pay me to do it? Somebody's got to, because otherwise I starve, and then I can't develop the drug, and then nobody gets better. So, of course, you have to have a system by which those who put their houses on the line and their money on the line to develop new ways of curing difficult diseases should be fairly rewarded for that, and that is what the patent system does. And it's no good the third world saying, we don't want to pay, because unfortunately, if nobody does pay, then we can't afford to develop these drugs. They won't get developed, and everybody, our children, will die anyway. So one has to be grown up about this and accept that for all that the communist parties of the world have been saying that the capitalists must give up their rights of patent protection, this is a thing the UN has been saying for years. The fact is that that is not how it works in the real world, simply because we who develop these drugs have still got to live somehow. And yes, if you're lucky and you pick a winner, and after £5 billion and typically 13 to 20 years of development, you have a product that can be widely sold in the market and it's successful, then everyone eventually makes a lot of money out of it. But the medication I'm working on, it won't even be on the market in my lifetime. And yet my fortune will largely have been spent in trying to develop it. And if somebody then says to my heirs and successors, well, no, we're not going to let you have any reward for what has been put into this, well, clearly that's not going to fly. So there
Isn't the reward of saving those children enough?
I'm sorry, but...
or is it just the money of having a house, which is 1,000 times better than that?
Are you going to send me your check for $1,000 to keep me going for another week or two doing this research? Well, I haven't heard you saying yes. It costs real money to do this research. It has to come from somewhere. And one of the sources it comes from is venture capitalists who lend us the money to do the research in the hope that when the thing goes through, we, through our patent protection, will be able to get the money back again, and perhaps a little on top. That is how the real world actually works. Because otherwise, we don't have the money even to feed ourselves while we're doing the research, and the research doesn't get done. It's perfectly hard-nosed and perfectly sensible. Of course, we would all love to help the children, but we've got to keep alive in order to do it. And that means somebody's got to pay us to do the work, just like anything else. Quite a lot of it is done as voluntary work. I do quite a lot of my work voluntarily and don't get paid for it. But in the end, I've got to be paid something, or I can't survive. And it's the same with the drug companies. Very few of them as profitable as they were, because drugs are increasingly expensive, regulatory regimes are increasingly tough, for understandable but not always good reasons. And so, you know, wake up and smell the coffee. This is not a communist world where everybody is naturally going to starve themselves for the sake of preventing others from starving. Because by the time you starve yourself, you've died, you can't contribute anything useful to helping others not to starve. So there has to be a balance. There has to be some ongoing payment to those who develop new drugs. And the best way of ensuring that is to give reasonable patent protection. In practice, many drug companies, as you well know, have a policy that for those countries where there is widespread disease which their drugs can cure, they will remit part and sometimes even all of the royalty in return for letting the drugs go there if they've managed to make enough on the money on the drug elsewhere to make sure they can pay to keep their company and their research going. So it's just a question of getting a right balance. And if we just naively say, oh, well, of course there should be no patent protection. Well, sorry, but we can't make a living that way. And if we can't make a living, we starve, and then everybody starves. Or they die of disease. Let's be practical about this and sensible about it and balanced about it.
We'll agree to disagree. Thank you.
A final question for Lord Monckton? Last chance? Anyone?
What do you mean by the usual suspects?
They're asking, who do you mean about the usual suspects?
Ah, well, yes, that's a fair question. There's a surprisingly small clique of politicians, international bureaucrats, and bad scientists who are driving the extremist version of the climate scare. And a lot of us call them the usual suspects because we know who they are. Thanks to the ClimateGate emails, which revealed who the scientific members of this clique were, I had already suspected that most of them were members of it. But it's a very small band of people who have done some more than questionable things. I mean, there's been actual outright scientific fraud by this group to try and promote the idea that temperatures today are warmer than they've been at any time in the last 1300 years. This is simply untrue, and the evidence in the literature that it is untrue is overwhelming. But nevertheless, they used statistical techniques which are actually under criminal investigation at the moment as fraudulent to try to establish that today is warmer than it was in the Middle Ages, when in fact the Middle Ages is known to have been historically, archaeologically, and in various other ways warmer than the present almost everywhere worldwide. So these, we call them the usual suspects because there is an element of criminality in what they do. There's certainly, and what they do, behave very aggressively towards those who disagree with them for honourable and sensible scientific reasons. And they hound them out of the scientific journals, they delay publication of the papers that they disagree with, or even prevent them altogether. And all of this is well recorded in the ClimateGate emails, a group of emails between this group that was revealed by a whistleblower at the University of East Anglia a couple of years ago. And another set of emails from the same source came out recently, showing quite clearly that data were being tampered with, fudged, bodged, hidden from people who wanted to check it, question it, and even destroyed to prevent anyone checking it because they wanted their storyline to be believed unchecked and unverifiably. And so we call them the usual suspects, the people who have been pushing the climate data and the climate scare beyond what is reasonable and balanced scientifically. And those are the usual suspects. And they know who they are, they know we know who they are, and several of them are going to end up in prison where they have committed outright scientific fraud. The fact that we now have the Attorney General of the state of Virginia in the United States actually investigating as a fraud against taxpayers the bogus paper that purported to abolish the medieval warm period and pretend it was warmer today instead, shows how seriously the prosecuting authorities are now taking the scientific misconduct and fraud on the part of those whom we call, in an almost affectionate way, perhaps we shouldn't, the usual suspects.
Lord Monckton, we're very grateful for your time, especially at this late hour. Last year, Al Gore graced our campus with his presence to the tune, I hear, of $250,000. And we're thankful that you came on for free, virtually.
I look forward to your check, because then, I mean, with $250,000, I could do quite a lot of medical research. And Gore doesn't spend it on medical research. He spends it on paying the enormous electricity bill in his mansion in Tennessee, which takes as 20 times as much electricity as that of the ordinary working guy in the United States. Al Gore is one who tells us to do things that he doesn't do for himself. And he's now a discredited and rather sad figure because the High Court in London found that his mawkish sci-fi comedy horror movie, which you've no doubt all been made to watch, is full of very serious scientific errors. And we were able to establish that because all the scientific errors pointed in one direction towards exaggeration, and because the errors were linked to various members of the usual suspects, this was in fact a political and not a scientific movie, and it shouldn't be shown in UK schools unless 77 pages of corrective guidance by the Department of Education were circulated to every school along with the movie. And once that happened and was publicised, Gore was finished. He's now regarded more or less everywhere as something of a sad figure. He's a joke. He capitalised on the scare at just the right moment. Now, really nobody believes him, and it's very apparent that you've been able to ask me questions, for instance. He will not take unscripted questions because he knows perfectly well he can't answer them. Whereas I hope, have been able to answer your questions. My answers have sometimes been tough, because if you play politics with this subject, you're playing politics with people's lives, with children's lives. And I don't like that. And I think you have to make sure, all of you, that you lift this subject out of the political arena, you keep it firmly in the economic and scientific arena, and you check the science, the references that I have given you, the satellite references, the data on temperature, to see who is right on that, and you check for yourselves economically whether you can possibly imagine that putting up windmills instead of nuclear power, or putting up solar panels, or having a cap and trade or a carbon tax could possibly make any difference to the climate that we could measure even with the most sensitive modern instruments and methods. And you will find that we can't. The whole thing is a waste of time and money. It is pointless, even if the science is right. And as you know by now, for various good scientific reasons, I suspect the science may be wrong as well as the economics.
So I take it you won't accept carbon credits?
Ha! No, I won't. Hard cash, preferably in dollars, would suit me very well just at the moment.
Okay. Any final comments for us here or questions?
Yes, I think the most important thing is this, that the Christian soul in Christian theology is comprised of three powers. Those of memory, of reasoning, and of will. And if we lose the power to reason, because we allow political forces in one direction or another to mislead us into tampering with science itself and tampering with the use of reason itself, so that we are far readier merely to adopt the party line because we are told that it is the party line, than to think for ourselves and check the data for ourselves, then we demean ourselves and the whole of our race back to the level of the beasts, because the difference between us and the other creatures in the visible creation is that we have souls, we have the faculty of reason to a degree that is simply not available to them. We are lucky in that respect. And if we allow politics to decide our view on scientific questions like global warming and what to do about it, scientific and economic questions, then we are throwing away and spitting upon the use of reason that marks us out from our fellow creatures. And we are denying one of the most essential aspects of our own humanity. And let us just very briefly, in concluding, look at what has happened throughout the 20th century when the use of reason was supplanted by mere politics. The Versailles Conference, after 15 million people had already died in the First World War, decided that savage reparations should be inflicted upon the losers, so that they had to pay enormous amounts of money to the victors. The amounts of money they were made to pay were so large that they made the Second World War inevitable, in which 60 million died. Then there was the eugenics consensus, where the scientists said, and that terrible phrase scientists say, you should run for cover whenever you hear it, scientists said that breeding humans like racehorses would strengthen the stock. It was a short step from there to the dismal railway yards of Auschwitz and Treblinka. 6 million Jews died in those ghastly death camps. Then, after the Second World War, in the new Soviet Union, and a peasant agronomist decided to repeal all the laws of agricultural science by announcing that seed corn would germinate better if soaked in water over the winter rather than planted in the ground in the autumn to get used to the cold temperatures. The result was 20 failed harvests when, through a folly and idiocy scarcely equal in the history of politics, the Soviet Communist Party made this idiot the head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and for 20 years imposed this nonsensical program on the whole of Russia. It was only when the Berlin Wall came down and we got access to the files of the KGB that we knew why it was that they'd had failed harvest after failed harvest, and they had killed 20 million of their own citizens because they had repealed the laws of reason. And again, in the 1950s, and the 60s, when the DDT ban was brought in and 40 million children were killed by that, because politics got in the way of reason and common sense and common humanity. And then when the HIV problem came along, and if the first few carriers had been isolated from the rest of us, of course their freedom of movement would have been restricted. And of course nobody wants to take that freedom away. But the result of not treating HIV just like any other fatal, incurable new infection and isolating all carriers is that 33 million people have died of AIDS who need not have died, and 33 million are infected and are going to die who need not have become infected. And in all these instances, decisions were taken not on the basis of what the science really said, but on the basis of what politicians wished the science had said. And these were politicians not necessarily only of the left, but also sometimes of the right. And in every instance, it was because the politicians were unwilling to do true science, unwilling to be balanced and careful and responsible in their decision-making. And instead, they knew what answer they wanted from the scientists, and they would go on firing the scientists that didn't give them the answers and promoting the ones that did. Al Gore used to do that a lot. And that way, humanity cannot advance. And 100 million people at least in the 20th century died in those episodes that I have briefly recounted to you now. Died because nobody stood up and thought to check what scientists say and economists say. And you should always check for yourselves. I often say this, do not believe a word I say to you. Go away and check it. And check it with an open mind. Check it not from a political perspective. Check it just because you really want to know where the truth actually is. Because truth alone, as Father Vincent McNabb used to say, is worthy of our entire devotion. And Abu Ali ibn al-Haytham, who 1,000 years ago first outlined the scientific method, said this. He said, the seeker after truth, and that was his beautiful phrase for the scientist, the seeker after truth does not place his faith in any mere consensus or political party line. Instead, he subjects what he has learnt of it to his own hard-won scientific knowledge and to scrutiny, inspection, investigation, inquiry, checking, and checking again. The road to the truth, said Al-Haytham, is long and hard, and that is the road that we must follow. If you hear the politicians telling you there are easy answers, sack them and get other politicians. If you hear the scientists telling you the science is settled, sack them and get proper scientists. And do not, I beg you, ever again believe what you are told is a consensus, for that is one of the most ancient logical fallacies exposed as such by Aristotle 2,300 years ago. Instead, as far as you can, and is within your power and time, check each for yourselves where the truth really lies, and do so fairly and with an open mind, and putting all political prejudice aside. For only then can the hideous deaths, these genocides of the 20th century, be avoided in the 21st and hereafter. Truth alone is worthy of our entire devotion. I commend that thought to you. God bless you all.
Have a good night, Lord Monckton, and a good 2012.
Thank you very much. Same to all.
Thanks. Bye.